So last spring, Chaplain Kello suggested to me how great it would be to have President Litfin, President Emeritus Litfin, come and speak in chapel this semester. But he also wondered if it would be great to have an interview format. He was commenting on the fact that those of you who are seniors, I'm the only Wheaton College president you've known. You've never had the chance to hear from the original DL Smooth, Duane Litfin, Wheaton's 7th president. And Duane, I'm thinking of this kind of as my personal town hall chapel. And I thank you for the opportunity to ask you everything, anything that I want. I've got a few slides that I'm going to show during our chapel time. And hopefully the first one of Dr. Litfin in a youthful contemplative pose will come up. Duane, I'd love to hear just briefly your call to faith in Christ and your calling to be a preacher of the gospel.
Raised in a strong Christian home in Michigan. Went off to college, didn't have a clue really what the Lord was calling us to do. I knew it would be some form of ministry. It was not really until I got into that master's program, Master in Theology, that had a clear sense of what it was the Lord wanted me to be doing. And we went off into, my whole seminary career, I spent it saying, I'm heading for an academic career. I'm not a pastor. I see some friends who have a pastoral abilities. That's not who I am. Academic, that's what I enjoy. That's what I'm good at. Okay, that's what I'm going to do. So I left there and went off into a PhD program. And the Lord has a great sense of humor. I was not even through with that PhD program when he put me in a pastoral ministry. Long story, but he did. And I realized that once that started going pretty well, and I realized that we were enjoying it, that I was saying too quickly and too early, that's not who I am, this is who I am. I didn't know myself well enough at the time to be saying that about myself anyway. But long story, the Lord took us through and brought us back into an academic ministry, both as a professor and then later here at Wheaton in this kind of a role. I can't say that I ever, people talk about a call to the ministry. I sort of envy people who have had these visions in the night or something. I never had any such thing. It was just a sense of the Lord directing us at each stage of our walk and trying to be where seemed as best we understood it, where he wanted us to be, and doing the best we could in that particular role until the Lord taps us on the shoulder and says, okay, come over here. The students would often ask, about your career. I don't have a career. I've never thought of myself as having a career. I think my job has been, I never foresaw what this was going to be. If you had asked me when I was your age, if you had laid out what my life was going to look like when I was your age, I would have said, you've got to be kidding. No way. Well, the Lord has a pathway for you that you can't see right now, almost certainly. Very few of you, what you envision is what will happen. Sometimes you see somebody, junior high, they want to be a physician. So they go all the way through in med school and practice, and they finish as a physician. Very few people these days are like that. Most of us have a very varied route, and we can't plan it all out ahead of time. Do as much as you can. In our case, it was the Lord leading us to know him early on in that Christian home, and then a step-by-step progress through our adult lives.
So one of the things you and I have in common is we both studied at Oxford, and I don't know if you'll remember it actually, but the first time we met was 20 years ago, your first year at Wheaton, near the dreamy spires of Oxford, when you were going around the world and being introduced to various Wheaton College communities. And I don't know if the trustees gave you a job description for being president. They didn't give me one. They just said, we think you know what the job requires, please do it. What do you think the president of Wheaton College does or should do?
That's really a very open-ended question that probably we could spend the rest of our time and the rest of the day talking about. It's a very complex 24/7 deal, as you well know. Once you step into this, you're in at the deep end. And I was talking to someone this week. When I was sitting in your office, I often could, if you had asked me, what are you going to be doing a year from today, I could look at my calendar and tell you. That's the nature of this particular role. So what does it involve? I'd summarize it this way, just looking at my own experience. I had, during my adult life, both academic experience and credentials, as well as pastoral experience and credentials. Did both of those. And I'm 50 years old, or turning 50, when I stepped into this role. The Lord called us here, and it was for the first time, almost 50 years old, that I could look back at my life and say, oh, that's what all this has been about. It is that combination of the academic with the pastoral, biblical, theological expertise, a pastoral concern for people, the academic credentials and expertise and experience. That combination, I think, is what this office needs, and President Ryken fills that bill very, very nicely.
So thank you. And so I had a couple slides here of you doing your thing, a slide of you at commencement, and a great shot of you with Sherry. I remember this photo, you folks in the convertible at homecoming, maybe your first homecoming at Wheaton. Then I wanted to show students this. These are some photographs that are in my office, and they were in your office. And it looks a little different now because your photo is in the frame. But as you look back at this amazing legacy of presidential leadership at Wheaton College, what are one or two of the things that you really drew encouragement and inspiration from the stories of those leaders?
Each one tells its own story. The truth is, Wheaton's, we still have only 8 presidents now in these 150 some years. So Wheaton's history is still told in terms of those presidential tenures. You know, Jonathan and Charles, I mean, they go from 1860 all the way up to 1926, those two. I mean, that's an incredible period of time. And then the others who followed. One of the lessons that I think you look at that history and say, the Lord called the right people at the right time into this place. And you see what each of them contributed, what the college needed at that particular time. And it's just a sense of God's sovereign hand on the college, providing the leadership the college needed at that time. Each one of those leaders, one of the things I did in my final year here is I had a series of chapel messages on my predecessors, my 6 predecessors. And the student body, I got huge feedback on how much they appreciated seeing that sovereign hand of the Lord providing the kind of leadership that was needed at each time. It's a good reminder to us. This is how the Lord works over time.
So one of the things I wanted to make sure these students realized is that every day their education is influenced in so many ways by things that happened under your leadership at the college. $450 million plus that the Lord provided for Wheaton College during those years. Lots of renovation of campus buildings, new buildings on campus. Huge progress in the ethnic diversity of Wheaton's campus. That was a progress area for us during your leadership. Just as you look back at all of that, everything that happened at Wheaton in those 17 years, what are one or two of the things that are most personally gratifying or satisfying about what the Lord enabled you to do at Wheaton?
You know, as I was finishing, I was getting that question a lot from people. You know, what do you want your legacy to be? What do you appreciate the most, and so on. It's sort of hard to choose. You're right, there are some really dramatic differences in the campus, the endowment, the enrollment, the faculty recruitment. There are all kinds of things I can look back and say, thank you, Lord. But I would say the thing that means the most to me as I look back is I inherited some real challenges in terms of unity on the campus. And by the time we finished, we handed over a wonderfully unified campus with a sweet spirit and with great consensus about who the next president should be. That move, that building of a sweet spirit and a spirit of unity and consensus and focus on the future, and that delights me more than anything else.
So another thing I wanted students to know is just the huge changes to the face of our campus during your leadership. And I've got a slide here that shows Everything in green is pretty much what it was when you came. Everything that's colored was renovated, new buildings, just huge changes to campus in those 17 years. It's really remarkable. I mean, if you were to go back and just walk the campus then, I think we'd be astounded at the changes.
You wouldn't believe it. Those of you who come, you're here, you look around and say, well, yeah, duh, this is it. No, this wasn't it. Well, you get alumni from 20 years ago who step on campus and say, wow, what a difference. For one thing, cosmetically, the most important thing we did was this walkway, which is now the Chase, named after President Chase. The brick pavers all the way over to the dining commons. That was Franklin Street, an old beat-up street the city had given the college years before. The college knew it was going to renovate it, so it didn't do anything to keep it up. It was ratty and weeds growing up. It was ugly as sin. And we turned it into this beautiful walkway. I mean, we built a lot more expensive things, sports and rec center and the dining commons or underneath the dining commons and so on. But cosmetically, I don't think there's anything we did that was more beautiful to the campus than this walkway. One of the things that I look back and see again the sovereign hand of the Lord, and it's one of the things I pray for the college today and pray for President Ryken's leadership, is the Lord put me here in 1993, kind of grabbed me by the scruff of the neck and stuck me here in 1993 till 2010. Well, you look at the economics, the economic environment during that time, and up until the last couple of years of that, which were, everything fell off the table in 2008. But prior to that time, these were really good economic times. And they were a couple of bubbles, the tech bubble in the 90s, and then the sort of the housing bubble into this century. But it meant that the stock market is booming and so on. And so we raised close to $500 million for the college during that time. But it's because it was a time of great economic prosperity and the generosity of the constituency of Wheaton. But I had the privilege of being here during a really good time economically. And of course, since 2008, there's been a very different challenge.
Yeah, it hasn't been like that.
Yeah,
no.
Exactly.
It's different now.
It is very different now. It's the so-called new normal, and you're absolutely right. But I look back on it, and I think, Lord, the Lord called us to the lines in pleasant places. It was a good time for us, which enabled us to do a lot of this.
Yeah, and I mean, just even as you're talking, it leads me to reflect, we continue to reap the benefit of that time. It's a blessing to us every day on campus. Well, I want to get into some of the issues that were controversial during your time at Wheaton. One of those surely was our change in mascot. I still go around the country and I talk to alumni from my era and earlier that just love to be known as a Wheaton College Crusader. And here's an example of our mascot back in the day. Our pilgrimage to a new mascot for the college really came out of some strong personal convictions you had and also experiences and relationships you had. Walk us through a little bit of your thinking behind the change in college mascot.
It's interesting, I still have people in the constituency who are upset with me for doing this. I'm a Crusader, always been a Crusader, I always will be a Crusader kind of thing. Which we always said, well, fine, that's great. We're not trying to deny any of that, enjoy that heritage, but for the future, this is what it needs to look like. In my case, here's how this came about. This is of interest to students. When I came, we had voices, particularly among the students, some others as well, a couple of faculty voices, but for the most part, students, a segment of the students who were exercised about this and just felt there were really good reasons why this was not a good mascot for the college, that we should be identifying ourselves with the Crusades, because if you go back and look at the history of the Crusades, there isn't really a lot there that you can look at and applaud that really, it's very problematic. And some people likened it to having your Torquemada, who was the Inquisition, Would you have a Torquemada as your mascot? No, because you don't want to be well, they had that same attitude toward the Crusader with the Crusades, and should we be identified? Well, and then the response was, well, that's not what it is. That's not what we mean. We mean like the Billy Graham Crusade. Yeah, but you got this Crusader back here that conjures that up. And it's not a question of what you mean. It's a question of what people hear or see, how they read it. And it was I had these voices, and we had enough on our plate. My response for the first several years was, look, I got enough fish to fry in my role here. This is not something I need to take on. And you know what changed that? an article in the Record written by a student. That student wrote that article, and it was so well thought out and so biblical, so Christ-centered, that I sat there reading this article, and it was a really good case for why we needed to change this. And I sat there thinking to myself as I read it, why am I not paying attention to this? We're trying to teach these students how to think Christianly about all of life. Here's a student doing this right before our eyes. Why am I not listening? That's what changed it. And that took me to really, I went back, studied the Crusades again, and said, you know, there really isn't much there for us to be identifying with. And whether we want to or not, that's what happens. For years, long before the rise of our current environment, Wheaton students were told, don't wear a Crusader t-shirt in Europe or in the Middle East or something. You say, what's wrong with that picture? And here we are coming into the internet world, where people can click on you from the other side around the world to find out anything about you. And we've got a mascot that we are sort of embarrassed by. We kind of have to keep it under wraps. Not a good idea, could see kind of, and sure enough, we made the change. A lot of people didn't like it, thought it was premature. Post 9/11, some of the strongest voices who were the most critical came to me and said, forgive me, I'm sorry, you were right. We are so glad we don't have the Crusader mascot anymore. But it was a student who prompted that. Let that encourage you.
So I got to ask you a question about our new mascot. So now we're known as the Wheaton Thunder. That's our nickname. And I remember there was a list of criteria for what we were looking for in our new nickname. And one of those criteria was it had to be something that you could render graphically. And yeah, well, we chose a sound. So people ask me this sometime, and I'm not sure I have a good answer. What's your good answer? I'm sure you've got a good one on that.
No, I didn't have a good answer either. My answer is, so, well, how do we portray this? And I said, well, we're not alone. You say, what's a Hokie? What does a Hokie look like? I don't know what a Hokie looks like.
A Sooner?
A Sooner, what is it?
Hoosier?
I don't know. Yeah, Hoosier, okay. We're not the only ones with a difficult to portray mascot. You can't have Thunder running around at the football game or something. Having said that, what I did was I said, look, I'm going to do the tough one, and I'll take the heat for it. We are going to change our mascot. What are we going to replace it with? I'm not going to touch that. And we put together a team of faculty, students, alumni, and they went out and surveyed the entire constituency, the alumni, for 6 months, a year, ideas. We had a list of 350 or suggestions or something, and that group was the one who studied it all through and came back, this is what we think it ought to be, and here's our rationale for it. And I said, I'm in, let's go.
So when people ask me that question, I can say, it wasn't my fault, and it wasn't President Litfin's fault either, right? Okay, that's good.
Let me just give you a quick anecdote. I was fearful, frankly, for some of these reasons as to how this was going to go. This was announced at I think it was a basketball game, some sort of the rally.
Was it King Arena?
Yeah, it was King Arena. And it was packed with students because they knew this was going to be the announcement. The entire student body didn't know what it was going to be. And so here's what, it hadn't sneaked out. And so we're there, and the announcement is coming, and you get all the way down to it, and they say, now here is our new mascot. We are going to be the Wheaton Thunder. Dead silence. For about 10 seconds. And within 10 seconds, the students started saying, Wheaton Thunder, Wheaton Thunder, Wheaton. A deafening Wheaton Thunder. And there was an immediate embrace on the part of the student body. I said, whew.
Duane, you mentioned 9/11, and that was a very significant world event during your tenure, and something that deeply affected this campus because we had not just one, but 3 alumni, and also at least one grandparent. Who were killed in those attacks. And I've got a slide here of from the Beamer Center, Todd with his boys. It's taken from a photograph. They're going to a Baltimore Orioles game. It was taken just a few weeks ago, a few weeks before those events. Just talk a little bit about what it was like to lead the campus through that time and what that experience was like for you.
I was actually in Cambridge on sabbatical, Cambridge, England, at Hawthorne House, our sabbatical house over there, when this happened. I was coming in across the backs into Cambridge to pick up my wife who had been shopping downtown. And I was sitting at a light and I heard on the BBC. And it was so shocking, I actually went through a red light. And there was a policeman sitting right there, right through this red light. He didn't stop me, thankfully, but, and I picked her up. We went home, spent the rest of the day watching it on the BBC, watching the towers come down. Also saw within 24 hours in Britain sort of how the Europeans were reading this, and the left in Britain were, well, America's getting what it deserves, and you're getting a whole different perspective than you would have here. That was on Tuesday, I think, and immediately tried to get home, and they were not letting anything across the Atlantic until Saturday. We were on, I think, among the first one or two planes out of Heathrow. Came back here, and by then, of course, that had been almost a week, and there was still all kinds of uncertainty about what does it mean, where's it all going, what else, other shoes to drop, what's going to happen. And I came into chapel, and I'd been gone now for months because I was on sabbatical. One of the great moments of sort of an eye-opener for me in my 17 years was that moment of walking out on this platform. The students didn't know I was coming. They knew I was gone. And when I walked out, the students stood up and gave a standing ovation. And I realized what that was. It wasn't a standing ovation for me. I hadn't done anything. It was a sense of relief. Our president is back. He's on campus and here to give us leadership, had excellent leadership through Chappie K and others. But it felt like, okay, the family's back together again. That moment was a very heartwarming moment for me of that sense of community, of we're all back together now and suffering and going through this together. It was a time of trauma for everyone, for all of America, but we didn't dodge it. We had some real grief. And I think there are ripple effects of that whole event yet in our lives together. The fact that we have a Beamer Center is certainly one of those. And we put this up because we really didn't want Todd's model to disappear. Todd and Lisa were just stalwarts that we really, this is part of Wheaton's history now that we don't want anybody to forget.
Another part of our history, Duane, is God has been pleased at times by His Spirit to bless us with seasons of revival on campus. That was something that happened during your time here. Any personal reflections on those seasons of revival?
Yeah, there was, in particular, not long after I had come, I think it was in 95, 96, somewhere in there, it was one of the most striking times of revival that Wheaton has ever had. Kind of every generation or so, every 30 or 40 years, these kinds of things happen, and smaller, less dramatic things along the way. But these events were really amazing. And one of the things that struck me in this, I mean, it was really dramatic. It was WCF started on a sunny night, and this thing opened up, and it was through, boy, if it told the story, if you haven't read that story, you read it. There's a book probably in the bookstore that will lay it all out for you. Really dramatic times. Wound up, we couldn't even fit anymore. We went over to the college church, and we're there in the evenings for like till 7 o'clock till midnight, night after night, all the way through. I think it was Wednesday or Thursday night that we said, okay, we need to land this airplane. But it was just amazing of students, one after the other at the mics, dealing with confession and repentance. And as soon as they would go finish and sit down, they would be surrounded by a group of other students praying with them. And there'd be somebody else at the mic. I mean, this went on for hour after hour after hour as there was a cleansing. As with every revival, there were parts of it. I was scratching my head. There were some parts of it. It's so easily the flesh can enter in, and you can have things being said at that mic that you say, oh my goodness, is this really a good idea? But I was determined not to hijack it. There were parts of it, pieces of it, that I thought could have been problematic, but I just said, Lord, guard us, protect us, and he did. I look back on it, I see the Lord really. But I felt like, I said along the way, I felt like sort of a dog in the back of a pickup truck going on the highway, and that. We didn't lead it, the administration, the president, the chaplain, we didn't start it, we didn't do anything but just kind of ride along with it and say, Lord, continue to work in our midst, work in me. The Lord touched me during that whole time through the students. It was a marvelous time. I'd never experienced anything like that. It's, I think, what revival, we talk about revival took place. It's kind of a paradigmatic version of revival now, in my mind, what happened there.
Yeah, and if students wanted to read about that, there's a real nice book by David Howard that really tells the story of Wheaton's revivals from the beginning, really in the history of the college. Nice little book, yeah, great read. One of the visitors who came to campus under your leadership was Bono, and my daughter still asks me from time to time when I'm going to get Bono to campus, so I don't know. But talk a little bit about how that came about and sort of how the evangelical community was looking at the AIDS crisis and what was significant about that visit.
It was a really interesting time to get Bono here. You can imagine what an iconic figure he is. And on this particular subject, I'll give a little anecdote that's funny. We were standing back here, back in the wings, ready to come on, and it was Bono and Ashley Judd, the actress, and so on. And there was some comments being made about Bono being a celebrity, and he, I guess he had already come out here, and so he gets this ovation from the students and so on. And Ashley Judd said to me something to the effect of, well, that's a bigger ovation than you get, or something to that effect. I forget exactly what she said. And I just jokingly said, because there's no way, Bono, come on. I said, no, the students, I'm a bigger star with him than he is. And I was just joking. It was it's so not true that it was a joke. When I walked out, the students gave me a bigger ovation than they did Bono. And Ashley Judd came to the podium and put her arms around me. She hugged me and she says, "You were right." The students can really be good to us, Phil.
Yeah, no.
On the other hand, they can also, it was a page-turning event having Bono here. Certainly, it was an eye-opener for the entire community, but it was also for me because it had been a growing something in me. But the event, it wasn't so much Bono, although it was his giving all of his credibility, all of his celebrity, harnessing it for a cause like this. I have always admired that. And he's done that in a lot of ways. I don't like everything about Bono, but I certainly enjoy and admire that. Well, just watching that really sort of got my attention. And we wound up sort of taking on AIDS as what can we do? You can't do everything, you can do something. What is the something we should be doing about this world need? And we saw the college really rise up and do some significant things, some things that fit who we are. Academic institutions like this have to remind themselves constantly, we're not a relief agency, we're certainly not a first response agency to crises, we're not this, we're not a church, we're not. What are we? Okay, now what unique contribution can this community make to this or to this or to, and keeping our contribution tailored to who we are and what God has called us to be. And we managed to do that with the AIDS crisis.
So there was one change that took place during your leadership that actually made Ripley's Believe It or Not. And most students probably haven't seen this. Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois held its first school dance in 143 years. Believe it or not, dancing had not been allowed since the Civil War. Social dancing of a certain kind, anyway, had not been allowed. But let's just talk a little bit about the community covenant, because that was a big change. I was a student under the Statement of Responsibilities. We have a community covenant that's different in its content, in the kind of document it is. Tell us a little bit about what that process meant and what you think was the most significant change that the community covenant introduced.
I get a lot of credit for having changed that, but really it's more credit than I deserve for this reason. that really came from our Board of Trustees. A lot of people don't realize that, but it really did. Back before I showed up, 91, 92, the board had done a revision of the doctrinal statement, that first major document of the college, and the second one is the community covenant, or what was called the statement of responsibilities, this lifestyle issue. These are the two primary documents that really shape this whole institution. And they said it was time just to look at our doctrinal statement. They did. And now here later, 10, 12 years later, they say, okay, now it's time to look at this. And they weren't being pressed. Nobody was lobbying for this. There weren't students, picketing saying it was none of that. There was no pressure from external, internal to do this. They simply said, it's time for us to look at it. We need periodically to do that. They did. And they did it all pretty much behind the scenes, although they had consulting groups of students and alumni and parents and faculty and so on, sort of little focus groups, but this was all done confidentially. And they came with what was the first draft of the community covenant. And I reworked it, but it's probably 90% what they had there. And what we brought forward, it was such a relief to everybody on campus. And I think the major difference is, I think this is more biblical. There is a way that the statement of responsibilities handled these issues that had a extra biblical quality to it in ways that I think the community covenant is much more careful about saying, wait, where does the Lord set his boundaries? How does he call us to deal with these issues? Let's, in this lifestyle community, try to deal with these issues in that way. And in that sense, this is a more biblically oriented. It's funny because in making the changes, we really took some heat for the colleges going liberal or slippage or all this kind of stuff you get. When in fact, this is a more rigorously biblical document than the previous one. And that pleases me. And we're handling some of the issues differently now than would have been handled beforehand.
What would be one example of an issue you think is handled more biblically in the community covenant?
I think alcohol. It would be a really good example. The Bible, I grew up, I'm a teetotaler, always have been, have no interest in alcohol, but on the other hand, I can't say for a minute that the Bible prohibits alcohol to believers. I mean, the Bible in some ways, valorizes alcohol. When your vines are full and the wine casks are full, this is a sign of God's blessing in the Old Testament. It was an alcoholic drink that the Lord held out and said, all of you drink it, at the Last Supper. You can't really say, alcohol touches your lips, it's sin or something. And we had a whole wing of our constituency, that's the way they felt about alcohol. And when we made this change, once again, we took a lot of heat from those folks. But the Bible doesn't handle alcohol with prohibition. It handles alcohol with care and how we deal with it. Alcohol is kind of like sexuality. Within proper boundaries, it's a good and beneficial thing. You get beyond those boundaries and it can be deadly and corrosive. We handle alcohol. Having said that, that is an alcohol policy that was changed for employees, where it was required of a lifestyle of non-alcohol of all of our employees. That was the statement of responsibilities. What the community covenant did not do was to change it for the student body and all of Wheaton College events and activities on campus and off. That is, however, and this was said in the old statement of responsibilities, but it was often missed, that is a prudential decision. That's not a question of holiness. That's a question of prudential. What is the wisest and most careful and prudential way of dealing with alcohol issues in an undergraduate student body? And you're trying to make prudential decisions rather than here's what the Bible says, we must do it this way. And the Bible also says a lot about how to make wise, prudential decisions. So it's not that somehow that prohibition is non-biblical. I think it's a perfectly legitimate thing for the college to do. In fact, needful. In fact, all of you, even if you feel the pressure of that, and that limits you beyond what you would like to be limited, those of you who are of drinking age, just put it back into the category if it's a good thing for you to let go of for the sake of the health of the community as a whole. and all the problems that would come to Wheaton College if you were to introduce alcohol into the lifestyle of this undergraduate student body. We are so much, you realize when you read the literature on higher education in America, one of the most pressing and leading problems is the problem of alcohol on college and university campus. I mean, it's a disaster. We are virtually free of that. I don't mean by that you don't have some of you who are not living up to your own community covenant commitments. Some of you may be doing that. But it's not a built-in part of life on this campus. And if you're doing it and feeling guilty about it, or at least you ought to be. And others look at that and say, that's not a good thing to do. I'd like to, but I don't because I said, I gave my word to something. This community is so much better off because at the undergraduate level, we're alcohol-free. Yeah. And a lot of you get that. And I hope even those of you who don't get that can look at it and say, okay, then I'm good with that.
So I just have one more question I want to ask. I wanted to show students this slide. I'm not going to ask a question about it, but your book, Conceiving the Christian College, has had a huge influence on Christ-centered education in North America. I had a shot here of my inauguration, which maybe some of the seniors will remember, but I wanted to just thank you publicly before this student body. Nobody has been more supportive of me and of Lisa than you and Sherry. And we benefit from that every day.
It's been
really
easy for us to do. What a great president.
I wanted if you really want to see something presidential, some of you will not have seen this great portrait of Duane Litfin, which is in the Heritage Room. If you get a chance to peek in there sometime, take a look. I also wanted to show you Dr. Litfin's children and grandchildren, just a beautiful family.
We are blessed.
I hear the women particularly oohing and eyeing over those beautiful grandchildren. Here's my last question. You've recently published a book called Word versus Deed, and it pertains to an issue that's quite relevant for how young people should live the Christian life and live out their Christian witness. Just give us the thesis of that book as a thought to leave with this morning.
Yeah, I wish I had the next half hour to address this because I wrote this book because of you or your predecessors. The book Word versus Deed is designed to address the challenge the church always has historically, maintaining the balance between the verbal witness of the gospel, the verbalized gospel, and our deeds, social justice issues of justice, compassion, mercy, and how to find and maintain the balance. And the book is designed to say, what does the Bible really say about that? This felt like the most urgent thing for me to address when I stepped out. I've got a backlog of 5 or 6 books that I want to be writing. This was the most urgent one because of what I picked up in the student body. And what I picked up was, number one, people who love the Lord. I mean, you come to all school communion, and there's just an electric quality to worship. It's a community of people where, despite all the faults that we have as a community, there is a real heart for the Lord in this student body. I love that. There's not a question of do you love the Lord, but I found a real passion, a growing passion during my 17 years as president on the part of students, a growing awareness for the social justice issues. Again, compassion issues, justice issues. Our students energized and passionate about them. But I also found a comparative waning of an interest in and a concern for the verbal witness, the preaching the gospel. And that really concerned me because while we were pedal to the metal in encouraging the social justice issues and the conscience, the Christian's conscience in our student body, recognizing that evangelicalism has often been sort of weak during the 20th century on that side of the ledger, you never want to let that displace the verbal witness. And I found students increasingly sort of relaxed about that. And often I get tired of hearing the old Francis of Assisi thing, preach the gospel every day with words if necessary. As if, well, number one, he never said that. But number two, the Franciscans are the ones who say he never said that. But number two, you cannot preach the gospel with your deeds. No one will ever come to understand the gospel by watching your deeds. Someone, somewhere, you, someone before you, after you, has to put it into words. The gospel is inherently a verbal thing, and communicating the gospel is inherently a verbal behavior. And we dare not sacrifice the verbal witness for the sake of the nonverbal witness of our deeds. Well, the first third is the importance of our verbal witness. The second third is, in the light of that, here's what the Bible says about our nonverbal witness and how crucial that is. And the third third of the book is about, okay, in the light of all of that, there are some passages of Scripture that really get abused in this whole discussion. Can we please handle the Bible a little more carefully in this whole discussion? And that's what that is about. So if this is of interest to you, and I think it is for most of you, I would really encourage you to take a look at that book. Even if you wind up disagreeing with it, I guarantee you it'll make you think about your disagreement.
Ladies and gentlemen, Wheaton's 7th president, Duane Litfin, and you're dismissed.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.